Good evening, everybody. Mr. Shrinivas Dempo, President AIMA and Chairman, Dempo Group of Companies, Mr. Raman Kant Garg, Commissioner of Income Tax Exemption, ladies and gentlemen. It is a pleasure to have you all with us today and a very warm welcome in the 62nd session of AIMA's long-running LeaderSpeak sessions. Mr. Garg, it's a privilege to have you with us in this program, and many thanks for agreeing to do this session for us on taxation and inequality. You're a senior IRS officer, and you've had an outstanding career in tax administration and policy making. You're the Commissioner of Income Tax Exemptions, and you're responsible for taxation of trusts in Delhi. Previously, you were Commissioner in the Central Board of Direct Taxation with responsibility for audit, PAC, and judicial functions. You have also been involved in investigation of many income tax cases involving some high-profile politicians, industrialists, and companies. We are privileged to have you as a fellow of AIMA and a life member. Thank you so much for joining us, and a very warm welcome to you. Mr. Dempo, it is a pleasure to have you with us, and many thanks for agreeing to moderate this session on a fascinating subject. You're the leader of a large and diversified business group and also a public-minded corporate citizen. And you've had your own perspective on the role and impact of taxation policies on economic growth and equality. We look forward to an absorbing conversation between you and our eminent guest speaker. Thank you so much for joining us, and a very warm welcome to you. Ladies and gentlemen, inequality has become a major issue of these times, and the after effects of the Occupy Wall Street agitation more than a decade ago and its copycat movements are still being felt around the world. The simplistic slogans of "we are the 99% and tax the rich" have fueled anti-elite movements everywhere and facilitated the emergence of populists in many parts of the world. Inequality has become a source of political and economic disaffection and instability, and there is a great deal of debate about the role of taxation policies in fueling or diffusing inequality. The trend in taxation over the past 3 decades has moved mostly in one direction, which is towards lowering the rates of taxes on personal and corporate incomes and expand the taxation of general spending. The arguments for the growth-oriented reduction in income tax have largely prevailed over the redistribution-oriented arguments for higher taxes on higher incomes. The governments have prioritized incentives for private investment and tried to achieve inclusion and equality through cash payments to the poor. However, the debate is far from over. The critics argue that the Indian government, generating nearly 2/3 of its tax revenues from indirect taxes, which are paid by the rich and the poor alike, those at the bottom of the pyramid are bearing disproportionate burden of taxation. Today, we are privileged to have Commissioner Garg with us to explain to us how taxation policies work to reduce inequality, and we can look forward to a very interesting discussion. With these words, it is my pleasure to invite you to hand over this session to Mr. Dempo and to invite him to take over. Over to you, Srini.
Thank you, Rekha, and very warm welcome to Mr. Raman Kant Garg, Commissioner of Income Tax Exemption, and ladies and gentlemen. Today is Gudi Padwa. I live in Goa, so we celebrate Gudi Padwa. Gudi Padwa is a festival that is known by different names all over the country. So I would like to extend my greetings of Gudi Padwa to our honored keynote speaker, as well as to all the members of the esteemed audience. Hope this year continues to be good, despite all the challenges that we are facing in the global economy. I'd also like to add to the welcome of Rekha and welcome you to this LeaderSpeak program. This actually started during the COVID time, and I'm very happy to inform you that the amount of interest this has generated amongst the audience at large. We've had different speakers from different sectors, such as economy, academia, from the bureaucracy to the elected representatives of the government. And today we have yet another very, very important guest of ours, Mr. Garg, who will speak on a very, very important topic, as Rekha said, which is hotly debated not only in India, but all over the world. Sir, we are very privileged to have you. You are a very senior and outstanding income tax official who not only excels in your job, but you are a thought leader and a serious thinker of taxation as an instrument of economic development and social equity. Ladies and gentlemen, as all of you all know, the global economy over the last 4 decades has grown very rapidly. And thanks largely to many governments' business and consumption-friendly trade and taxation policies. In India itself is a classic example. I know during my grandfather days, we used to pay 90% income tax as business houses. And that has really evolved. And today, I think we can be compared globally, and we are competitive globally in our taxation system. And yet we've had so many reforms, whether in direct and indirect taxation. So I must compliment the entire fraternity of income tax officials who have contributed their share in making India a globally competitive economy as far as taxation goes. Technological advances are continuing to aid innovations in production and distribution, as well as large-scale movement of both money and work. However, what it has done is the speed and scale of change has concentrated, as Rekha says, the wealth and power with a few, with advanced know-how and networks, and left the majority struggling to catch up. The very visible efforts by global corporations and ultra-rich people, as we know them as HNIs, to pay as little tax as possible, has created tremendous disgruntlement among those who really lack the resources and the wherewithal to avoid paying taxes. There has been a revival of the socialist economies, even in the most capitalist countries, as we've seen so many debates happening in all parts of the developed world. And these have joined forces with green movements and so-called NGOs to challenge the established consensus on private economic expansion. In fact, the extreme inequality has emerged as a key social, political, and economic disruptor all over the world, and not only in our country. And taxation policies have come in for intense scrutiny for their role in producing such inequality. Globally, currently, there is a deep rethinking of taxation philosophies and their role in driving immediate economic growth, creating long-term economic capacity, and achieving socio-political stability. The debate about balancing between driving growth through lower taxation and striving for equity through higher redistributive taxes is occupying the minds of most economists and policymakers. Since the early 90s, the taxation trend, as I said earlier, has been towards cutting corporate and personal income taxes to really encourage production and consumption. And that has happened to a large extent. And governments have reduced their role in critical public services, such as education, healthcare, and transportation. There has been a preference for letting the private sector meet the demand for public infrastructure and services. And the government basically takes a regulatory role, as the government's capacity is circumscribed by its taxing and delivery capability, and its efficiency is compromised by distorted political incentives and large self-serving bureaucracies. The critics of this approach, however, accuse governments of abdicating their role in developing the overall economic capacity through investment in the poorer people and less prosperous states, which also are encouraging unfettered extraction and pollution of the planet by local and global companies that have short-term incentives of profit generation. The growth-first movements in many developing countries have tried to counter such blame by increasing their inclusion and redistributive efforts through cash transfers that finance the purchase of products and services from private producers. These transfers are paid for by extending the tax net to the informal economy, as Rekha said, and achieving higher tax compliance through intensive surveillance of financial lives of the population and businesses. Ladies and gentlemen, there is no ideal taxation system, and we can debate this point for many hours, on which everyone would ultimately agree. And ultimately, it's the specific situation of an economy that determines how the government should go about providing incentives for getting rich and helping the poor get by. The key challenge that most growth-focused governments face is ensuring that many people get reasonably rich and increase their standard of living, instead of just a few people cornering the national income and wealth. We are privileged for this topic to be discussed. We are really privileged to have Commissioner Garg with us, and we can look forward to learning about the new thinking in using taxation as a means of democratizing economic growth, income, and wealth. I do not want to stand any further between you and the honorable speaker, and may I now invite Mr. Garg to deliver his opening comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Rekha ji. Thank you, Shrinivas ji. Firstly, for very kind words about me. And secondly, for setting the stage on this very interesting topic, inequality and taxation. Ladies and gentlemen, friends, a very good evening. It's indeed a pleasure and privilege to me to speaking on this very important, contemporary, and thought-provoking subject, inequality and taxation. As you would have noted in the introductory email inviting you to this session, as well as introductory remarks from moderator and DG, that inequality has emerged as a major social, political, and economic disruptor. In fact, it erodes the faith in the social and political institutions. Central to the idea of inequality is the issue of fairness. How are the resources in a country, in a given economy, distributed among various segments? The extent of inequality, which is prevalent globally, can be seen from some of the statistics produced by World Inequality Report 2022. As per this report, as on 2020, the top 10% of global population get to corner 52% of global income. And bottom 50% of global population has access to only 8.5% of global income. And when you move to wealth distribution, the distribution is even more skewed. The top 10% almost corner 76% of global wealth, and not even 2% go to the bottom 50% of the population. Such is the skewed distribution of wealth and income across the globe. And this brings the spotlight squarely on the issue of fairness in the society. What kind of society we are creating, we are wanting to live in. How do you explain to a common man who doesn't have access to a good education, who doesn't have access to health facilities, and who doesn't have access to a stable, fairly paying job with dignity, when there is such a stark inequality prevalent in the society? I would say history of the man is the history of struggle against inequality. As late as 1920, there was no universal adult suffrage. Women did not have right to vote for elected democracies till 1920. It is only in 1920 or around thereabout that women got the right for adult suffrage in economies like United States and United Kingdom, and around that time in other developed countries. And if we go back even 100 years back, you would realize even the adult males did not have a universal right to vote. The voting rights were restricted on the basis of property ownership and some kind of income and wealth criteria, which restricted voting rights to less than 10% of the population. Such was the vast political inequality prevalent just a century back. We are not talking of very, very long period. However, in this period, we have moved rapidly, and 1950s onward, we have universal adult suffrage across almost entire corners of the world. And there are only very few small pockets where we may not be very satisfied with the kind of voting rights available to civilization. But by and large, we can breathe a sense of satisfaction at the state of affairs as far as political equality goes. However, it is said, political equality is only half the battle. It is meaningless in the absence of there is no sense of having equal voting rights if you do not have access to basic services which allow a person an opportunity for self-actualization, for realizing the self-potential of an individual. There is another way to look at inequality in the historic context. In the earliest stages of human civilization, when the earliest state was organized in the form of bands, as hunter-gatherer societies, as bands and tribes, probably there was very little inequality because there was no surplus in the society. Whatever was gathered from the forest or could be gathered by hunting, by gaming, was consumed on the same day or next few days. There was no surplus which could generate any kind of inequality as far as economic inequality goes. The first greatest impetus to inequality rose with one of the greatest inventions, revolutions humankind has seen in the form of agricultural revolution. It is with the birth of agricultural revolution somewhere between 10,000 to 15,000 BC that set the stage for inequality. Because for the first time since man's existence on this earth, a huge surplus could be generated, which could be carried from season to season, which could be carried from year to year, and along with which defined property as an asset in its own kind. Along with it came differentiation of labor, specialization of job, and the rise of cities. Still, economic inequality was tolerable. It was not striking. The next major impetus to inequality came with the next great revolution in the form of industrial revolution, somewhere around 1850. Of course, from 1500 AD onwards, there was a Renaissance period. A lot of discoveries and innovations were happening, but all of them transformed into industrial revolution somewhere in the middle of 19th century. And during this period also gave rise to another invention in the form of joint stock company, as we know the companies today, which was a very novel structure, which allowed the pooling of resources and de-risking individual liability to a particular venture, and gave rise to a new kind of financial instruments in the form of equity shares, the value of which could rise dramatically based on the value of the enterprise. And next phase in this journey of inequality comes with the modern age, the age in which we are living, the age which is laced with the growth of information technology, the rise of big tech, as we know, the rise of big financial institutions, the rise of hedge funds, venture capital funds, startups, robotics, nanotechnology. This has given a further impetus to inequality, with possibility of a few persons cornering large shares of income and wealth over a very short period of time. This journey of inequality can be seen from some broad brush picture of statistics produced by World Inequality Report. It has come up with the ratio of income of the top 10% and bottom 50% of the population, and it says that in 1820, the ratio was 18 between the average income of top 10% and average income of bottom 50% of the population. This increased to a factor of 41 in 1910, the era of Gilded Age, unbridled expansion of industrialization. This further increased in 1980 to a factor of 53 between average income of top 10% and bottom 50%. However, surprisingly, from 1980 to 2020, it has moderated to a factor of 38 from 53. This is the broad brush picture of inequality seen in a historic context. Our discussion of inequality will be incomplete if we don't say a few words about the work of Thomas Piketty, who has done a great job, a momentous job in the field of inequality. As per his central proposition, the return on capital is more than return of growth seen in the last 500 years of analysis. And the outcome is that the people who have recourse to capital continue to grow exponentially as compared to the general population, as compared to the average man. And this is the central proposition of inequality prevalent in today's society. Return on capital is more than economic growth. Secondly, our discussion shall also be incomplete if we do not say a few words about communism. Communism came as an alternate economic model as compared to free market liberal order. It arose in the background of massive industrialization, massive worker exploitation, very poor facility to the labor, and massive expansion of industry. It came out of the works of Karl Marx and Engels, who gave up two monumental works, Das Kapital and Communist Manifesto, somewhere in the last 2 decades of 19th century. But it actually came in practice with the advent of Soviet Union, somewhere in 1921. Soviet Union rose like a colossus in the period from 1920 to 1990. It generated awe and wonder at the sudden growth which it experienced with its centralized planning, centralized distribution of resources, centralized setting of quotas and prices. It worked on the thesis that from each according to his ability to each according to his need. But that model didn't work for long. Its own collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. And this model of centralized setting of prices did not work as compared to market determined prices, marketing signals. And the system collapsed with the fall of Berlin Wall and disintegration of Soviet Union. And this provoked an important title of a book, The End of History by Francis Fukuyama, a very eminent author, which basically proposes that with the demise of Soviet Union, with the demise of communism, we have only free market liberal democratic order as the only prevailing economic system as tested over a period of time. However, this model, this economic model is under the threat of inequality. Inequality is seriously questioning its credibility and legitimacy. Now, what is the solution? We have this massive inequality and massive disrupted in the form of inequality, where and how from here on? And what is the role of taxation? Where does taxation fit in? Well, taxation is one of the tools available to tackle inequality. It is one of the principal tools available with the country. It is often said, taxes is the price we pay for civilization. But then we have to see what kind of civilization we want to build. It's a civilization riddled with inequality, or a fairer kind of society which we want to build. Do we want to build a society based on individual excellence, or we want to build a society which celebrates community? In order to understand the role of taxation in tackling inequality, we need to understand the kinds of taxation systems. There are broadly two types of taxation systems. One, which is levied on sales and production and known by various names over different periods of time. Sale tax, VAT, excise duty, GST, customs. These are the various names by which it goes. The other is taxes on income, which go by various names like income tax, wealth tax, etc. Both of these tax systems have different effect on the society and inequality. The first kind of tax, which is on production and sales, is a sort of consumption tax. Whatever is produced, goods or services, tax is levied on that. And whoever consumes those goods and services pays the tax. It doesn't distinguish whether the consumer is a poor man or a rich man. They both have to bear the same burden. And we also know that bottom 50%, generally the average income of bottom 50% is sufficient enough to cover their consumption with very little left for savings. So it means that their entire consumption basket is exposed to taxation. Whereas at the other end of spectrum, comprising 10% of the top population, we realize that only a fraction of their income is spent on consumption. So only that fraction which is consumed is exposed to these production and goods taxes. As compared to that, taxes on income are so organized, can be so structured progressively that you can exempt a basic population below a particular income, and as the income go higher, you keep on increasing higher and higher taxes. They are said to be, in a sense, progressive taxes. And goods and services tax are generally said to be regressive taxes. It is for a society to determine what kind of burden distributed between direct taxes and indirect taxes we want to impose on the society, so as to satisfy the needs of the state for resource mobilization for its various needs and the needs of the society, and also to distribute the burden in such a manner that it is equitous, it is fair, and it promotes equality. It strikes in some manner at the roots of inequality. At the close of my address, I would say inequality is not inevitable. It's a political choice. The burden is on us to create a political consensus by debate, by discussion, and to arrive at the modes and the manner in which we want to impose taxes on the society, and how those taxes are to be used by the state in order to promote growth as well as equity in the society. Thank you so much, friends, for a very patient hearing. Thank you.
Mr. Garg, thank you so much. And I think that was very, very interesting, educative. You gave some very, very startling figures about what has happened in the past and, what is the current trend amongst income distribution. You also talked about the various economic models and how with, various testing, at the end of the day, the free market is the one which has survived. You talked about, how does one look at it politically? And, how do you try and start bridging the gap as much as possible? If you allow us, we have a few questions to ask you. And, I'll start with one. There is always a debate about the peak income tax rate, and that it tends to be either a favorite political tool on either side of the ideological divide. To what extent do you feel that the peak tax rate contributes to inequality reduction? And to what extent does it remain a propaganda device? Your views, please.
If we see historically, taxes on income, it's entirely a modern phenomenon. Consistently levied taxes on income, they came first time around 1930 as part of First World War resource mobilization. Before that, we have history of direct taxes going to around 1798 in UK, and even before that in somewhere in China and somewhere in Egypt. But they were very, very, very episodic and they did not survive for long. Consistently levied income tax is a modern phenomena starting from the period 1930. And the tax levied were very, very moderate as compared to what we see today. Very limited, very small quantities of taxes on income were levied at that time. But after the Great Depression of 1929 and the New Deal administration, taxes continued to rise. And then we had World War II, when the taxes rose even further. Taxes continued to rise. In 70s, as you also said, that your grandfather period you experienced somewhere around 90%. And I think in India, the peak rate was 97% at that point of time. Till 1980, period from 1970 to 1980, they started realization that the whole thing has gone too far. There has been massive expansion of government. There is large explosion of public sector. It has rooted in inefficiencies into the system. And this marketing signaling system is failing. There is lack of productivity growth. There is lack of economic growth. So in the period between 80 to 90, what we refer to the period of Reagan and Thatcher was the real striking back of the market economy. In the background of what is popularly known as Chicago School of Economics, the theories of Milton Friedman, they gave fresh impetus to market-based systems and dismantling of public sector. What we experienced from 1980s onwards, it reached a pinnacle in the form of Washington consensus in the middle of 90s. Popularly, it was said to be Washington consensus of low tax rates, smaller governments, lesser subsidies, all public services to be priced at some rates, things like so and so. But even that model now has come with a question mark. With the great financial crisis in 2008, again in the last 10, 12 years, 15 years, we are having the debate for the right size of government. There are segments where the world feels that government should be there. Education, health, public transport, climate action. So over long periods of time, we have seen different kind of thinking prevailing. And of course, the peak rates have come down. We have very, very moderate rates right now. But even these rates, where the income tax rates, let us say in UK, individual income tax go right up to 65%, 63%. In Japan, go up to 55%. In European countries, they are somewhere around 50%. Even in the US, they are almost, the top rate goes to 50%. So they are not a propaganda. They are meaningful tools to address issue of inequality.
Thank you. Thanks. If I may ask a follow-up question, in a country like India where the tax base is relatively small. I know it's growing now. I know compliance is growing. If you see the figures every year, it's very encouraging to see more and more people paying taxes. But mostly, if you look at our economy, there is low personal and business incomes. What do you feel? Are we at a very reasonable rate of personal and income tax at the moment, or do you think there is a case for reduction tomorrow if the compliance levels go up? What's your feeling on this?
Well, it's a very, very interesting question. And of course, as you said in your introductory remarks, there is no thumb rule as far as taxes go. Different times, different kind of people choose different kind of things. So we have also seen in the history of last 100 years how we have gone through. But yes, India as of now has a very moderate income tax structure. We have around 25% rate for the companies, which is even lesser for some companies, going as low as 17.5%. And personal income tax goes at 30%, with surcharges and all, it goes to 33%. And for very high income, it goes up to 37.5%. So as of now, we have a very moderate tax regime. So I won't say that there is any space for tinkering. Of course, there is always discussion. Somebody would want tax rate to come down and somebody would want tax rates to go up. But we are at very moderate, sensible levels as of now.
Thank you. And I would tend to agree with you that we are at, sensible levels of taxation. There is a question from the audience. It's from a member by the name of Manjul Kumar, who said, "Sir, you mentioned political inequality. So how you see the role of ideological inequality in Indian as well as global political conundrum?" And the second question he asked is, you mentioned Thomas Piketty. Can you throw some light on global inequality in post-pandemic world as per, Piketty's philosophy or research?
Well, of course, ideological inequality, that is one way of looking at it. There is another way of looking at is ideological extremes. We have center, we have ideological left, we have ideological right, we have various kind of fundamentalism, including religious fundamentalism and fundamentalism of adhering to very certain different kind of ideas. And how that is rooted in the idea of inequality. Inequality strikes at fairness, erodes the faith in the existing social and political institutions. And the discontent it generates is generally transformed into some kind of ideological extreme. Whatever may be the prevailing in a particular society, whether it's a leftist kind of extreme or a right kind of extreme, or an ideological intolerance to issues of immigration, or some kind of cult, religious cult, which gains ground, nobody can predict. But inequality provides the hotbed in which all these kinds of ideas grow. And second issue which touched was of pandemic. Of course, pandemic has been such a striking force. Of course, it has hit the poor harder as compared to the people who had resources of living in big houses, of being able to afford the best medical cares. We have people living in very congested conditions with absolutely very poor access to healthcare, being exposed to pandemic, being out of work, living from day to day. So it has hit hardest to the bottom 50% of the population. There is no denying that. Sure. And I'm not sure whether any particular principal idea propagated by Mr. Piketty on.
Yeah, thank you. Also, India is on a very fast track growth. If you look at many economies of the world, today we are one of the fastest growing economies. We are becoming a very large economy. We are the 5th largest economy in the world now. Has a definite part to go into the top 3 probably before the end of this decade. According to you, how long should it take India to reach the rich countries' tax to GDP ratio of about 25% plus?
Well, we are still a long way. We are still a long way to go. Tax GDP ratio right now, if I remember correctly, in United States it is around 24.5, and in the OECD countries it is somewhere around 33%. And we are somewhere struggling at 11.5%. And a large part of the reason why our tax GDP low is because we have a huge informal economy. And also the fact that the point at which income tax gets triggered, let us say that in Indian context, we start levying income tax at an annual income of 2.5 lakh. But average income earned by bottom 50% is 2 lakh. So straightway, almost 60% of your population is outside the tax. We still have a long way to go and match with the OECD numbers. But before that, we need to catch up on growth. We need to catch up on equity before our tax GDP ratio, and we need to catch up on formalization of economy before we catch up with OECD numbers.
Yes, very well said, and I completely agree there. There is also a question from another member of the audience, who is in a way connecting to the informal economy. He says, is not ensuring living wages, those engaged in basic activities like agriculture, the starting block for ensuring equality?
Well, there will always be different kind of schemes by the government. There will always be different kind of schemes. We had this Manrega scheme, which was basically a rural-oriented wage employment scheme to ensure that rural population has access to at least 100 days of work in a year. So those are the kind of schemes or the variations of that which can always be debated. But all those schemes will always have in their competition the resources available with the state to meet so many of other things. We need to plug into high growth, and we also need to ensure that we can provide education, healthcare, some kind of job security for the bottom 50% of the population. The kind of developing stage India is a challenging task. I don't have any easy answers for that.
Sure. So again, let's move on to negative taxes or transfers for, from the tax kitty for the poor. According to you, what extent does funding the poor's spending improve equality compared to providing them income opportunity and capacity? Do you have any views on, the transfers that happen?
Well, at one level, my reaction is that inequality per se is coming to be understood as an antidote to growth. It is proving to be detrimental to growth. Through some kind of a mechanism of collecting taxes and investing in the society in the form of education, healthcare, job security is in fact growth promoting. We are providing impetus to the growth. And within that, we have two competing thoughts. One is directly putting money in the people's hand, and another is we create some kind of mechanism that they have a short kind of work available to that. Both have their merits and demerits. So it all depends on the kind of political dispensation at that particular time which favors that particular idea. No thumbs, no straightforward answers available for that.
Yes. Also coming to, many of the developed economies like the US, they are currently leading campaigns to impose a global tax on transnational corporations. How practical is it for India, who is now, trying to attract so much of FDI into the country, so much of tech investment and manufacturing capacities. So, somebody who wants to invest companies like this, what are your views whether, this kind of taxation, to impose a global tax on transnational corporations? It's okay for a developed country like the US to say, but if something like that is employed on a global basis, do you think India would benefit or India would stand to lose?
As a person with academic interest, I would say that this multilateral based, consensus based mechanisms, they are good for everybody at a first level. I'll tell you, there is such a huge criticism of these multinational corporations paying almost negligible taxes, not even 1% in their home country, not even 1%. And with massive profits, massive compensation to its top employees, and not contributing to the society. What kind of fair system is that? They have grown from the civilization. They have grown from the investment made by the state in education systems, in the university systems, in the healthcare. They have emerged out of a background of civilization. And you're not willing to contribute it back because you could exploit the system of using offshore, using tax havens, using very smart structuring. So this global consensus on a global minimum tax is a very welcome step. In my opinion, I think I would go with that.
I think great perspective and thought. My final question to you, and I know we've taken a lot of your time and discussed on various issues. Recently there have been a couple of Supreme Court judgments on the taxation of charitable trusts and foundations. And many corporates like us run foundations, not only now, CSR has become a buzzword now, but for example, my family has been running charitable trusts for the last 3 decades now. And, the certain rulings that have sort of complicated the issues in terms of, taxing of the charitable trusts. What do you think the government can do to maintain incentive for trusts, those who are doing genuine work, to provide education, while also preventing tax avoidance? All of us have to be conscious of the fact that, genuine charitable activities have to be done. So any thoughts on this, sir?
My first take on this is that this non-profit sector, this trust societies and NGOs comprising non-profit sector is a very, very important pillar of the society. They plug in that space which represent between inability of the state and aspiration of the people. It fills in that gap, which state is not able to walk to that mile, and people have aspiration for those products. First. Secondly, Income Tax Act recognizes a lot of activities as charitable activities. For example, relief to poor, education, medical relief, yoga, maintenance of monuments and environment protection, etc. And then there is another one which is called general public utility. It's a general kind of thing where any kind of activity which helps people is put together in this banner, general public utility. And it is this particular item, this particular limb, which has a very big fetters attached to it as far as to ensure that it is not misused for commercial purposes. And we have this recent Supreme Court decision with respect to this last limb, with which a lot of fetters are attached. And we are all, means it is comforting for all of us that Supreme Court decision has in fact removed some of the fetters, eased some of the fetters attached with the provision, made life easy for a lot of these non-profit sector entities. It has not restricted the interpretation. It has in fact widened the interpretation to the convenience of everybody, and it has made it more practical in operation. So there is no need for any concern or misgiving on the part of people who are engaged in charitable activities.
Thank you for those views. And once again, thank you, Mr. Garg. I think we had an extremely interesting session. I think you are very, very knowledgeable. You educated all of us in terms of starting from how inequality is perceived and what could a nation that is growing like us do to get equality and fairness to all. I know there are no easy answers, as you said, and every question can be debated. But I felt that we got a lot of inputs from you. There are a lot of wonderful comments on the chat box. So if you have time to go through it, people really appreciated your talk and your thought process on a very, very important topic. Because I think as India grows and, India is going to be more and more powerful, there's no debate about it. But the key question that will remain is, how do we distribute the income in all fairness and justice? Because everybody doesn't get equal opportunities, and that's everywhere in the world. It's not only in India. But to what extent can we do and try and be as fair as possible? And I think your discussion on a very important subject helps us to clear our mind. So thanks for that excellent talk once again. Just to let you know, more than 300 people participated in today's session. We had different platforms like LinkedIn, apart from this direct LinkedIn, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter. So it's gone very, very well. It's gone viral. So thank you so much again. And I would now, give the mic to Rekha.
Thank you, Srini. Actually, there are many more than 300. We have about 280 on the other platforms, and I think about 150 here. And as you can see from the comments, it's been a very well appreciated session. Taxation is a very tricky and sensitive topic, I would say, for everybody, not just the corporate taxpayers, but also individual taxpayers. But today's session was outstanding. I think it's a very, very important topic that you touched upon, and you explained it so well. And as Srini said, if you have time, do read the comments which are there on the chat box. Thank you so much for joining us today. And maybe, if you have time in future, we'd love to do another session on another topic on taxation, because taxation is here to stay. It's not going anywhere. And I think the more we learn about it, the better it is for all of us.
Rekha, probably in physical mode. So
in physical mode, yes.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much. One last word. The views which I have expressed are entirely personal, and nothing is, of course, it doesn't represent any way the view of the government. They're entirely personal.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I also want to say thank you to all our participants for participating in this very interesting debate today and very interesting conversation. And we look forward to having you with us again. So thank you all and good evening.
Thank you. Have a great